Hey everybody, welcome back. FMT100. We're looking at Unit 7.5 or Section 7.5 and bearing installation and removal. And if I appear to be a little winded, I apologize. There was an incident and I needed to take care of it on the farm. I'll do many things in a kilt, but fighting a wildland fire is not one of them. So, moving on. Uh, so bearing installation and removal. So when we are getting ready to install and even remove, that sounds odd, but even removing a bearing, there is prep that should be done. And what's nice, it's the same for both. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to clean the area where the bearing is at, as well as the surrounding area. We're trying to remove as much debris as we possibly can. And this once again is for both installation and removal. So if we're trying to remove a bearing, we should clean up the shaft as best we can, get rid of any rust, any built up grease and grime and all that other stuff. If we're trying to push a bearing out of a housing, we're going to clean up the seat where the bearing is at. We're going to clean the area between the seat and the bearing. It's going to be nice and tight, and there's always a little bit of crud that gets junked up in there. Try and clean all that out. Any excess rust, paint, clean all that out. All right. So, and this is going to be especially true when we get ready to install. So once again, if we're looking at installing a bearing on a shaft, we want to prep that shaft. We're going to get that shaft as clean, as pristine as we possibly can. Degrease it. We're going to take emery cloth. We're going to clean that shaft, get rid of any excess rust, any galling, any huge burrs or anything like that on the shaft. We're going to get those all gone. We're going to even prep if we're trying to press a bearing inside a housing. We're going to do the same thing. The seat or the cavity where the bearing goes into the housing. We're going to make sure that's clean and clear of any big burrs, any rust, any buildup of paint, all of that. We're going to make sure it's all gone and clean up. If we can do that, our installation is going to be so much easier. We also reduce the risk of damage of the bearing while we're installing or removing it. And all of this is, if we're able to reuse the bearing, we add longevity of the bearing on removal. And even more importantly, we ensure longevity and proper operation of the bearing upon installation. So that's what we've got for our installation. What's really sucks is they only give me this slide for this, and I think that's kind of a travesty because there's a bit that kind of goes into installing and removing a bearing. So we're going to do removal first because that's usually the first thing you have to do is remove a bearing. And they actually have, as they show you in the book, they've got bearing removers. And that is going to be your best bet. And a bearing remover is a very specialized tool. And what it does is its claim to fame, and the best part about it, is it is supporting both the inner and outer rings when the bearing's being pulled out, or in this case, it's usually off a shaft. So when we pull a bearing off a shaft, both the rings, both the inner and outer rings, are being supported as the bearing is being pulled off the shaft as a whole. I know this sounds kind of stupid. You're like, well, why does that really matter? Well, if we just try and pull on the outer ring, we are going to pull the bearing in half. So you'll get the outer ring off if you're just pulling on the outer ring. If you pull on the outer ring, you'll pull the outer ring off, and the inner ring will still be stuck on the shaft. Has it happened to me? Yes. Even with a bearing puller, it has happened to me. Very frustrating. And yes, then out comes the angle grinder and a cold chisel, and you're trying to cut through the inner ring without touching the shaft, and you end up using the cold chisel after using the angle grinder for a little bit so you can get the last little oomph. Yeah, it's just try and do the proper thing. Use the proper tool, a bearing remover, to get the bearing off. All you're going to do is you're going to set up the bearing remover so the entire bearing is supported. Yes, there will be a slit because the bearing puller comes in two halves. Get the two halves together, and then away you go. All right, you're going to do the best you can. In some places, you can use an arbor press, and you can press a bearing in and off, doing the same method. You got to support the entire bearing, the inner and outer rings, and then you can press the shaft either on or off. So that's removal. Installation. We can do an arbor press, which is usually can be really easy. And I keep saying arbor press. Oh gosh, the best way to describe it is think of it as some of them look like an industrial uh, drill press, and you've got a wheel or a lever that you spin, and that lowers the arbor and then presses on the shaft, and you've got the shaft set in the bearing bore, and as you turn the wheel, you're pushing the arbor on the shaft, which pushes the shaft into and through the bearing. Others use a hydraulic press to do the same thing. It's called a bearing press. Now, my absolute favorite, if we are installing a bearing on a shaft, is heating the bearing. So we're going to expand the bearing just a little bit by using heat. We're going to heat the bearing up to about 180 degrees, 180 degrees, 180. And that is enough to get the steel in the bearing to open up. It opens up by expansion. And all we need is a few thousandths of an inch. And then we can literally slide the bearing down onto the shaft. It's best as you are warming up your bearing to double check your shaft. Make sure your shaft is perfectly clean. Because if you get hung up on the shaft and the bearing's not in place, you've got to bring out a bearing remover and remove the bearing and start all over again. You also want to make sure you mark on the shaft where that bearing is supposed to go. So once you get to it, you can stop and let that bearing cool. Cooling bearing. This goes by quick. You heat them up, it takes a while. It does not take that long for that bearing to cool down, especially when it's get close to the metal of the shaft, because the metal of the shaft helps start pulling in the heat. So that bearing cools down real quick. So it's always best to mark everything beforehand, and then when your bearing's heated, once again, between 180 and 200 degrees, that's hot enough you can't touch it, so out comes the gloves. And then you'll slide it on. Different types of ways of heating it. There is the inductive heater or the, God, I hate it, the resistive heaters. I don't like the resistive heaters because those tend to heat up too much, in my opinion. And they're nothing more than, it looks like even the inductive look like a cone, but a regular inductive heater is just a cone with a heating element in it. An inductive heater uses induction, kind of like a transformer, to heat up the bearing. And that one, you can actually get some pretty precise temperatures out of that method. So that tends to be the industry preferred. If you don't have either one of those, there is still the old-fashioned, the old standby of an oil bath. So you put your bearing in a small little dedicated pot, and you fill that pot up with some lube oil, preferably non-detergent lube oil. You warm up that oil to 180 degrees, between 180 and 200 degrees. I tend to go right around 180 degrees. I've had the best luck with that, though 200 seems to be the max. You'll have to double check with your bearing manufacturer to see what temp they recommend. And you warm up the bearing, you pull it out of the oil bath, and you can slide it on. So Yeah, that's it for insulation. Um, if you have to drive a bearing on, which sucks, but every once in a while it happens, or maybe you need to adjust ever so slightly the bearing position, you're going to have to find a proper um, oh God, I can't. I call it a sleeve, and I know that's incorrect, but it is nothing more than a a metal sleeve that will go over the shaft and match perfectly with the inner bearing. Once again, you're going to have to come in contact completely with our inner rings. And I said inner bearing. My apologies. Inner ring. You want to come in contact completely with the inner ring. And from here, you get to tap not the bearing, but that sleeve. And you're going to have to tap alternately on left side, then right side, left side. And you're going to rock it down that way. You never ever strike a bearing directly to either put it in or take it off. All right. Unless if you're going, I want to damage this bearing, then yeah, then you're going to hit it directly. But you never strike directly. You're going to want something that'll absorb the blow, but still transfer the pressure down to the bearing, so you can push the inner ring down. Now that's on a shaft. If you are pressing a bearing into a housing before you have it on the shaft, you are going to find the proper sleeve that will match the outer ring and maybe just be a smidge smaller. So now the the sleeve will fit inside where the bearing housing is. So as you press the bearing into the housing, you don't get hung up on the sleeve that you're pushing the bearing into. You'll get out into the field, you'll be able to use the tools, and this will make more sense. If we were in lab, I'm not even sure what we have at City College, and I would have to walk you through it. On the farm, we tend to use Schedule 80 PVC if we have to press any bearings into housings. The Schedule 80 PVC is inexpensive, and we don't have to buy something, oh my God, really expensive to get the job done. If we need to adjust the outer diameter of the PVC, we just use emery cloth and we sand the Schedule 80 PVC, which is thick PVC, uh, down to the size we need, and we go from there. So that is one way. So I do have a bearing puller, and I can manufacture a hydraulic press if need be. So I even do the same things I talk about here, even on the farm. So enough of my yammering. Let's get this one over. The last thing we have to deal with is failures, which typically comes from either improper insulation removal or lubrication. Those are a couple others, and we'll take a look at those as well. All right.